great fire swept through Rome in the year 64, 30 years after Jesus died. There were by then so many Christians in Rome that the Emperor Nero chose them as scapegoats to kill the rumor that he had started the fire. He had thousands of them tortured to death. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote an account of this mass execution. This is almost the only contemporary mention outside the Bible of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for the moment.
Tacitus is certain Jesus died as a criminal. He was sentenced by a Roman official, and it was Roman soldiers who carried out the execution. For those who believe that Jesus was primarily a spiritual teacher and healer, this raises a difficult question. What exactly did Jesus do to offend the most mighty empire the world has ever seen? Rome, the power center of the world in which the early Christian movement expanded so rapidly. The majesty of St. Peter's in Rome speaks of a Jesus ruling the universe, the light of the world shining down from on high. The Jesus of the fledgling church was very different. The early Christians needed a God who was accessible, who knew what they were suffering, almost who suffered with them. They were despised as dangerous, immoral, and seedy. Over the years, the primitive church in Rome buried their dead in an underground network of Christian cemeteries, catacombs. Do you have any idea how many people would have been buried here altogether?
There were probably thousands, because these go on literally all the way around the circumference of the walls of Rome, and all the streets leading out of Rome. There would have been miles of them, literally miles.
As I went deeper underground with my guide, Dominic Crossan, we passed some of the finest examples of early Christian art. Amongst the biblical scenes, there's the Good Shepherd, one of the earliest pictures of Jesus. But why no crucifixion or resurrection?
That's the extraordinary thing, Mark. If you imagine reading all the Christian texts up to the year 200 and then guessing what now will they paint on their catacomb walls and carve on their sarcophagus faces, we would be embarrassingly wrong. We would say, of course, there'll be a crucifixion, there'll be resurrection, there'll certainly be Last Judgment. After all, they're being buried.
Yes.
So there should be pictures of the Last Judgment up here. Instead of that, we get pictures of a young, beardless, healing God.
Does this mean that to them, the resurrection, the Day of Judgment, the crucifixion were not important?
No, I wouldn't want to say that, and I wouldn't want to say there's a complete, as it were, disjunction between the popular piety and the official, you might say, scribal piety that we read in the texts. But if you ask what were on people's mind, they saw God, they saw Jesus as a deliverer from the pain of life's agonies, as it were. And it is very much about life on earth.
The life of Jesus began in the reign of the first Roman Emperor Augustus, who seized supreme power after years of civil war. In Luke's story of the birth of Jesus, it was Augustus who ordered the census that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. In Palestine, there was widespread resentment against Herod, the half-Jewish king whom the Romans appointed and protected. He wanted to appear a loyal and benevolent Jew. He rebuilt the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in magnificent style and persuaded the Romans to give him the title King of the Jews. But he also had the reputation of a ruthless tyrant, as in Matthew's story of the wise men's quest for a rival King of the Jews, the infant Jesus.
Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, was in a furious rage, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under.
The unrest caused by this political oppression at the time of the birth of Jesus was further fueled by an economic crisis in the countryside.
Social and economic conditions meant that it was much better to be a fisherman than a farmer. The burden of Jewish taxes lay most heavily on the rural agricultural population. The fishermen always had fish in the sea, but the farmer had to contend with bad crops.
Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor has studied the social climate of first-century Galilee.
And even when things were going well, taxes were very high, between 40 and 65%. He was walking a very narrow margin because a small bit of land had to produce food for 3 groups, the owners, the animals, and seed for the following year. Then there had to be a surplus for birthdays and marriages. There had to be a surplus for plows and equipment. And there were famines roughly every 25 years, so that men on the land were inevitably forced off it. From free farmers, they became tenants. From tenants, they became landless men.
And in Judaism, land and the land you owned was of particular significance, wasn't it?
It was so precious to the people that God says that he owns the land, they are his tenants. They have no absolute control over the land. It was given to them for their use to be passed on intact to the next generation.
The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Say to the people of Israel, the land shall keep a Sabbath. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. The fields of common land belonging to their cities may not be sold. I am the Lord your God, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God."
It's difficult to imagine in this peaceful setting how provocative the oppression had become. This doesn't look the sort of landscape for revolutions.
Nonetheless, because of the tremendous burdens that rested on the shoulders of people for different reasons at different times, Herod was permitted to take 200 talents of silver out of Galilee. That's 10 tons of silver, well, over £1 million. Now that, people crack under that sort of pressure periodically. And so there was a tremendous resentment building up at the time of the birth of Jesus. When Herod died, Galilee broke into revolt, and Varus tramped in with the legions from Syria and smashed everything, flattening the capital. That's what he did, destroying, burning the crops.
After the death of Herod, the whole country was prey to disorder, and ambitious individuals set out to make Judea was filled with brigandage. The Galileans, seizing this opportunity of venting their hatred of the cities they detested, rushed forward, intending to exterminate. Varus sent his troops across the country to capture those who had been involved in the sedition, and crucified 2,000 of the ringleaders.
In this atmosphere of revolution, revenge, and reprisals, Herod's son Antipas succeeded his father in Galilee. The cities Antipas began to build provided a new focus for his subjects' resentment. In the Roman remains of Bethshean, Professor Dick Horsley explains this spiral of violence in Galilee at the time of Jesus.
No sooner had the Romans destroyed the city of Sepphoris and enslaved the people inside and round about, but Antipas began rebuilding Sepphoris, and then he built a completely new city in Tiberias over on the lake of the Sea of Galilee. And when he built those, as a man who'd been raised in Rome and who had imbibed Roman culture, he decorated and built his own cities in a style befitting a Roman client ruler. So here would have been all around at the center of things, Roman culture that Antipas would have imported with his decorations on his palace, with colonnades in the streets, and with other trappings of Roman culture that would simply have said, "This is Rome, you folks better like it or lump it."
Yes, but in many countries, India for example, monuments were built to provide work. So surely there'd be many Galileans who were happy about the cities because they got work out of them.
Well, perhaps, but here was work that meant that you were building an alien culture. In these installations here, the amphitheater or the gymnasia, there would have been exercising in the nude. There would have been games with beasts, and such things would have been absolutely scandalous to Jewish culture. And of course, let's remember what funded the cities and what funded such entertainment would have been the economic exploitation of the indigenous population, which supported both the city and the other layer of taxation supporting the Roman troops that would have been based here.
So really you paint a picture of economic oppression of a people burdened by enormous taxation. Where does this picture then come out in the gospel stories?
One of our difficulties understanding these Gospels has been that we have tended to read it as religious literature. We've tended to spiritualize these stories. But the meaning of these words in the earliest layers is not that of spiritual life or that of religious life. Those words are very concrete and very economic. Cancel our debts in the Lord's Prayer. And Jesus telling parables about the importance of canceling each other's debts. And Jesus giving the Beatitudes saying, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry. Those are the people who are going to inherit the kingdom." So Jesus is speaking repeatedly and very concretely to the situation of the people, which is a desperate poverty.
Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Where does the Good Shepherd of the Catacombs fit into the society of rural Galilee?
Well, first of all, he was from a peasant village. That's about the best thing we know. Nazareth, I mean, you might guess maybe 200 people. It was very close, of course, to Sepphoris, so it's not that he is an isolated rural phenomenon that has never seen a city. He lives within 4 or 5 miles of a big Roman city, which he never mentions, by the way. I don't think he forgot about it. I don't think he liked it. And I think a lot of the peasants knew exactly what the city was. Of course, there were some benefits, but in terms of their way of life, it was dislocated. So I think that's the group that Jesus is especially working with, the line between the poor and the destitute.
But would you say which side of that line he was?
My suspicion is that he may have gone from poverty to destitution himself. And by that I mean from having your own subsistence farm and being able to keep your family to having lost the farm, or being pushed off it because there's too many children or something like that, and some of them have to go out into the big world off the farm.
But his father was apparently a carpenter, not a farmer.
The term that's used, tecton, for a carpenter is, in a peasant society, never presumes what we would think of it as a separate industry all by itself. That is a farmer who has a sideline business. An artisan in a peasant community is lower down on the pecking order than the peasant farmer. Peasant farmer, peasant artisan. If you're only a peasant artisan and have no land, you are down below the peasant farmer who has his own farm.
I find the picture of Jesus as a leader of the poorest of the poor very attractive. I've seen enough poverty in my life to know how oppressive it can be. And I've always felt that Christianity should be summed up in those words from the Magnificat, which I've heard so often at evensong. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich empty away. As I approached the tourist spa of Tiberias, one of the hated cities of the rich in the 1st century, I wondered why Jesus spent so much energy on healing when he was leading a revolution to raise the poor. There's an ancient tradition of healing in this area. For thousands of years, people have been coming to these hot springs of Tiberias to be cured. And at last, we're beginning to realize that healing is more complicated than we used to think. That there is a link between all those pressures on us, our relationships, our work, and our health. Of course, that was taken for granted in Jesus' time.
And he called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal.
We have so many healing stories. We have to assume that Jesus was a healer. And certainly, we must understand this in the context, and he would have understood this in the context of the kingdom of God. Here's what he's pronouncing is that God is finally taking action for God's people, and then he himself must understand himself as the conduit of this energy, this healing energy that restores people's lives individually and collectively. And so in one healing after another, it would be manifesting the energies, God's energies, the divine energies, for the restoration of life and to make it whole individually and in that community.
As I see it, healers like Jesus cured the mind, the body, and the spirit. Healing was also a purification. It restored the sick to their friends, to their family, and to their community. But I still can't really understand what's so revolutionary about healing. Perhaps it wasn't so much the actual healing as the crowds of the poor and dispossessed it attracted.
Jesus at this stage in Galilee had moved from being a supporter of the law, as the disciple of John the Baptist, to being a critic of the law. And I think it came from his perception of the law, of the situation, where men forced off their land were obliged through necessity, they had families to feed, to become sinners in the technical Jewish sense, herdsmen, carters, anyone involved in the transport business, because theft was too easy. So that these were the sinners with whom he associated. And he recognized that even though the law classified them as opposed to God, they were victims of misfortune or an iniquitous tax system.
What was the significance of the meals which Jesus ate?
The significance of meals in the Middle East is very profound. It is the supreme gesture of hospitality to receive someone into your space to offer a meal. So when Jesus ate with sinners, that was a statement that he was accepting sinners as people who were worthy of association. Now, there would be no criticism if he ate with sinners in order to convert them, but there's no hint of that. He associated with sinners because he believed that they were victims who were loved by God.
Then he commanded them all to sit down by companies upon the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied.
The core historical question, it's almost so obvious that we forget it. Why did Jesus happen when he did, where he did, not some other time? And it's the dislocated peasantry, the peasantry who were being pushed off their lands, pushed from poverty into destitution, from subsistence into destitution. That's the group especially that the Jesus mission is directed to. And for them, healing and eating are the core problems.
Because they didn't get enough to eat?
Because first of all, they don't get enough to eat. It's as basic as that. That's why the first thing the kingdom talks about, say in the Our Father, is enough bread for today. We won't even look for tomorrow. Just enough bread for today. That's what destitute people need.
And the healing?
The healing is especially the itinerants whom Jesus sends out, he sends to the householders. Now, why do the householders particularly need healing? Because those are the people who are terrified of being pushed off their land from poverty, which is the normal condition of peasants. Poverty, I mean subsistence life. Pushed into destitution, losing their land. So it's a symbiosis, as it were, an interaction between the poor and the destitute. That's where Jesus is directing.
They said to him, Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes.
One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him.
They brought to him a paralytic lying on his bed.
He even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak.
Levi made him a great feast in his house.
And immediately they received their sight and followed.
And the dead man sat up and began to speak.
Rise,
And immediately the leprosy left him.
take up your bed and go home.
And they all glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us.
It is poignant because we have these stories of the mass feedings. Now, if those go back to any incidents at all, anything in the ministry of Jesus, then they weren't exactly picnics. Think of where they're taking place. They're taking place in the wilderness. And what's the symbolic significance of the wilderness? Well, it's that desolate place where people go, where they're out of the eyes of the authorities, and where they can have a sense of their larger numbers involved in this movement of resistance and social revolution.
Did the rulers then, did Herod Antipas in particular, see Jesus as a threat?
We don't know for sure, but we have 2 indications in the Gospels that there was a good bit of conflict there. The tendency in the Gospel material would have been to weed out anything about Jesus and Antipas, because eventually it focused on events in Jerusalem. But these 2 cases are quite interesting. One is Antipas inquires of Jesus, and Jesus fires right back and calls Antipas that fox. Tell Antipas that fox that I will be about my program, and it's going to be finished promptly today, tomorrow, and the next day I'll be on my way to Jerusalem.
I'll finish you.
And that's right, I'll finish. And the other one is when John the Baptist's disciples come and ask Jesus, "Are you the coming one, the one that we should expect?" Jesus refers to all the things happening around the healings and the poor having good news preached to them, and then he asks rhetorically, "What did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft raiment, a man living in a fancy palace?" It's almost certain that that's a reference to Antipas, and in such caustic terms that it leaves no doubt about what Jesus thought about Antipas, mocking Antipas to the people upon whose backs Antipas had built his new city, his fancy palace, and lived in his soft raiment.
At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following. For it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem."
When Jesus came to Jerusalem, he confronted the corruption and conspicuous consumption of the rich. The evidence of the affluence of the upper-class Jews has been excavated by archaeologists and is now preserved in this museum. Here was a way of living and dying which Jesus would never have seen in rural Galilee. Yaakov Meshura of the Israel Museum showed me that the splendor of the rich was evident even in death.
Well, first of all, we find a lot of very luxurious tombs that they could afford cutting and hewing in the stone of hard limestone of Jerusalem to have what's so-called family tombs and so forth. And not everybody could afford it, but those rich people could buy a mountain or piece of a mountain and cut their own tombs and have it decorated, and inscriptions were shown. Were cut on the rock to show
like
to
the
whom
inscription
it,
up there.
Up there, this
Yes.
belongs to
Yeah.
a famous family of priests, the so-called Chazir family. They were very rich. Of course, they were in charge of collecting the money from Jews. You know, the people used to give the temple tribute money and other promises, gifts, and so forth. And a lot of money was accumulated in the temple, and it was a kind of, the central bank of the Jewish people. And they became very rich, and this is why also there was a lot of opposition, of course, against these people.
So when the Galileans went to the temple, would it be like sort of corruption, wouldn't they? There?
Yes, they would consider some of the deeds of the priests as corruption. For instance, I'm sure that they didn't like very much that they had to buy the tribute shekels from the priests, from the money changers, and pay 8% just for the changing of money. They brought their own money from the Galilee, and they had to pay it for with Tyrian shekels that they had to buy from the money changers in Jerusalem. This is why the money changers were so hated by people in Jerusalem.
Do you have one of those shekels too?
Sure. This is a Tyrian shekel. This is made of pure silver, and this was the only currency accepted at the temple as tribute money. And this is why, for instance, in the New Testament, Jesus says to Paulus, take this shekel and pay for yourself and for myself, because the tribute shekel was actually half a shekel, which means one whole shekel for two.
So and this shekel could be one of the shekels which fell to the ground when Jesus overturned the money changers.
It could be, it could be, yes.
Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought at the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons.
all these shops around, Dick, I can't help wondering, what do you think was Jesus' attitude to money?
You know, I can't imagine that Jesus or other folks who came from villages or small towns would have had much contact with money. It wasn't yet a monetarized society, as far as we know. On the other hand, money would have symbolized the large cities, where, of course, the coins were minted, and would have symbolized Roman power.
And Jesus was also accused of encouraging people not to pay their taxes, wasn't he?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?
How do you interpret that famous saying?
In order to understand that saying, we have to understand how the people at the time would have understood that saying. And for those people, their only rightful king was God. The only rightful king to whom they owed things was God. So when Jesus answers, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and unto God what's God's, there would have been no question in the minds of the people that nothing belongs to Caesar and everything belongs to God.
But surely, Dick, you can't have that. Jesus must have meant give something to Caesar, otherwise he wouldn't have said give something to Caesar.
We need to go back and notice that this is a trick question that the Pharisees and Herodians are asking Jesus. They know exactly where he's coming from, and they're hoping to entrap him with this question so that there's then a basis for arresting him, doing away with him. And Jesus is so subtle, so shrewd, that he can answer the question without saying anything culpable, but with having the populace understand exactly what he meant. And what he meant is based directly in that understanding of God as the true king, so that everything is owed to God and nothing to Caesar.
At his trial, Jesus was accused of stirring up the people. Now, do you think that was a false accusation or a true accusation?
Certainly it's been interpreted as a false accusation, but simply look at the Gospels. The Gospel writers themselves understand it as a true accusation. After all, what have they just portrayed? Jesus marched up into Jerusalem on a donkey, fulfilling Davidic prophecies of the Messiah. And then, of course, if we take that temple demonstration seriously, as I certainly do, there was a dramatic prophetic demonstration that was the closest thing to violence we come to in Jesus' activity, overthrowing the money changers' tables and with whips, driving people out. And just the things that he was saying against the temple and against the high priesthood, those would have been agitating comments. Of course, the people would have been stirred up.
Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium.
And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate.
And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head.
And they stripped him.
And they struck his head with a reed and spat upon him.
And he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull.
Was Jesus crucified because he spoke out against the corruption in the temple? Was it because he stirred up the poor and the destitute? Was it because he constituted a threat to law and order in an occupied state? Was it because he was a revolutionary?
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of
He
heaven.
stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place.
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No,
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied.
Woe to you that are full now, for you shall hunger.
I will destroy this temple that is made with hands.
I came to cast fire upon the earth, and would that it were already kindled.
Isn't Jesus the left-wing revolutionary, the patron of priests who've opted for the poor, a very modern picture? I'm sure it's right as far as it goes, but for me it leaves out Jesus, the spiritual teacher, Jesus, the emblem of God's love. These are the figures who, according to the Bible, inspired the early church and still inspire Christians today. After all, the Jesus of the Gospels did say, "Man shall not live by bread alone." And Jesus the revolutionary is only about daily bread. The real mystery to me is why the crucifixion wasn't the end of the story. After all, thousands of rebels were put to death in that blood-soaked century. Why did the movement which Jesus began survive the leader's death?
Well, the one thing that's important that I see before the death of Jesus is that the Jesus movement is an empowerment movement. It's a movement in which Jesus tells people to go do it yourselves. Don't just come to me. Go do it yourself. Go heal, go preach, bring the kingdom. Jesus in that situation is not the whole center of everything. Jesus can die and the movement can survive. And that is exactly what happened.
The movement survives because the followers go on healing.
Because the followers keep healing. Because there are people in Galilee who were doing it probably for maybe a month before they even found out Jesus was dead. And the kingdom didn't stop at 3 o'clock on that Friday afternoon. It still went on. They were still experiencing the power of God through Jesus, and Jesus was gone. So now somehow Jesus is still present, still empowering people.
What about those who say the followers lost their faith and only regained it because something truly remarkable called the resurrection? We don't know exactly what happened.
In a way, that's almost the way the story has been told in the last chapters of the gospel. I think the followers of Jesus lost their nerve, not their faith. They ran, and maybe that was a very good thing. We have a lot more dead first Christians. But it's a very different thing to lose your nerve and lose your faith. They didn't lose their faith. I think that would be a libel on the first Christians. They ran, but they stopped running, and they still believed that God had worked through Jesus.
All scholars agree on the importance of the resurrection. They disagree about what actually happened. There are good reasons for accepting a version nearer the Bible, and Ed Sanders is one scholar who does. What was the importance of the resurrection, Ed?
It's absolutely necessary for Christianity. It's the thing that made Christian faith happen. Indispensable.
Well, what happened then at the resurrection?
Now that's the difficult question. Let me start like this. Either the disciples had resurrection experiences or they made it all up. It's a hoax or fraud of some sort. Now, since some of these men were in the end going to give their lives for their belief, I think that the idea of a hoax or fraud is not likely. So I take it that something really happened. That is, they had resurrection experiences. But when it comes to describing what it was they saw, oh, that's really difficult. If you think of the passage in Luke where Jesus talks all afternoon with two disciples and they don't recognize him until he sits down with them and breaks bread. It seems clear from that sort of story that the Christians did not favor the view that Jesus, the risen Jesus, was a badly wounded man who was able to get up and stagger around for a bit, or a dead man who had been resuscitated, who had a short lease on life given back to him so that he could stagger around for a bit. No, on the contrary, he was not recognizable by people who knew him. And Paul comes up finally with the formula, spiritual body. Now, I do not know any more than anyone what a spiritual body was, but it was the best he could do.
And I've certainly never seen a spiritual body either.
That's right.
So you would say that nothing which could be described as miraculous happened after Jesus' death? Nothing really like the resurrection happened then?
Well, visions, of course. We know that Paul had a vision, and visions are at the start of every religious movement, so visions can be taken for granted, but visions are of what you most want or most desperately fear. They don't explain why you have that want or you have that love or you have that fear. That comes from the movement that was there before Jesus. So the resurrection for me means the continuation of that movement, that a docker at Corinth listening to Paul can experience the power of God through Jesus, and doesn't say, I believe you, Paul, but I believe God. I can experience this power, this empowerment. That's what the resurrection means for me. It's got nothing to do with a body coming out of the tomb. It's got nothing in itself to do with a vision. Those are what I would call parables of resurrection, but they're not the resurrection itself.
I can't say whether a body came out of a tomb, but I don't think a parable is good enough, nor is a modern explanation of visions. Surely the followers of Jesus believed they'd experienced an event. If they didn't, the church was founded by liars, and they aren't normally very inspiring. The blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. Those Christians gave their lives in the certain faith that they would be resurrected. A faith based on the evidence of the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Peter, one of the most important witnesses, was himself martyred right here in Rome. It's one of the greatest paradoxes of history that a marginal rebel on the edge of the Roman world should come to be believed in by the Roman world as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The secret of Christianity's success was that after the first few emperors, the Roman Empire began to flounder. Paganism, with its many manifestations of God, didn't provide the firm faith or moral guidance that men and women sought in those uncertain times. They turned to Christianity with its belief in one God and its strict morality.
For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand.
3 centuries after Jesus was put to death as a criminal subversive, the Emperor Constantine accepted the Christian faith himself. Ravenna on the east coast of Italy was for a time the capital of the empire. Its many churches show us Christianity as it became under imperial patronage. Confident, wealthy, powerful, and prestigious. In the glittering mosaics, Jesus wears the imperial purple, very different to the simple tunic of the Good Shepherd of the catacombs. Does this splendor show that the rebel joined the ruling class? Is the man who challenged Rome now on the side of the emperor? Was it a complete sellout?
The emperor is there clothed in purple. He has a halo around his head. But notice 2 things. He is carrying a gift, and the gift is rather large and gold, and he's taking it towards Jesus. And also notice, by the way, he's standing up. Now, when you turn from the lower register where the emperor is to a much higher register, you find Jesus seated, notice he's seated, on the world. On either side of him are 2 angels, and the only people up there with him besides the angels are a martyr and the bishop. There are no imperial courtiers up there. And Jesus, seated on the world, still wears sandals just like the sandals that he would have worn long ago when it all began.
And he's way above the emperor there, isn't he?
He is way above the emperor.
I like this warrior Jesus in the chapel of the Archbishop of Ravenna. I suppose I shouldn't really, bearing in mind all the religious wars that Christians have been involved in and still are. But just look at this picture. There's the warrior Jesus standing on a serpent. Well, that's understandable. The serpent is, after all, the symbol of temptation. But with the other foot, he's trampling on the lion, and that's the symbol of the empire of imperial authority. And I like to be reminded that although the Church has often seemed to surrender totally to the powers of this world, it's never quite forgotten that it started as a revolt. Jesus the rebel was a man of action. But there is a more profoundly spiritual Jesus too, and it's in the desert, away from politics and empire, that we can find him.
Amen.